Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to discuss, at viewer request, double action, single action triggers, or DASA, versus striker fired triggers. And Leia's going to have some zoomies in the background apparently. Now, longtime viewers of the channel will note that I've already done a video describing the different types of trigger systems, their pros and cons, definitions, all those types of things. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and check out the link in the description to the original video. However, I found this video request very interesting because with the trend in the market, with law enforcement and concealed carry practitioners moving towards striker-fired handguns more and more every year, Glock takes up 60% of the market, and that doesn't even count Smith & Wesson, SIG, or any of the other striker-fired handguns that are available out of the market, taking more and more market share of the law enforcement market with their striker-fired handguns. However, the DASA has still managed to stick around. And that's interesting because, you know, the trend shifting towards striker-fired handguns started in the 90s and really picked up speed in the early 2000s. So you would think that this trigger system would have long ago waved bye-bye. However, it seems that there are an awful lot of people who make a transition from striker-fired handguns to DASA triggers. What are you doing? To DASA triggers. And every now and again, you'll see a new product come out of the market that is DASA. There are manufacturers that have really made their names on DASA guns. CZ comes to mind. CZ has a striker-fired handgun line in the P10 series. However, DASA guns like the CZ75 and its many variants, the P07, the P09, all those handguns are what most people associate whenever it comes to CZ. Hi, would you like to hang out? Or what are commonly associated with CZ as a manufacturer. Now, that's not to say that the CZ P10 series are not good guns. The CZ P10c, previously viewed on the channel, highly recommended. Link in the description. As was the CZ75 SP01 Phantom, also previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description. Fantastic handguns. SIG still produces a lot of DASA guns in addition to their striker-fired P320 series, and the SIG 226, the SIG 229, those are market mainstays and have been for decades, let alone the SIG P220. There are lots of really great DASA guns out there on the market, and there are people who are still dedicated to the DASA gun. And you know, I remember when Langdon Tactical revealed a version of the Beretta Model 92, and Grand Thumb did a video on it, and everyone just lost their minds. Everyone had to have the LTT Beretta 92. And I've seen those guns pop up in competitions and stuff like that. Guys are still out there running DASA guns and running them well. Highly ranked competitors are still running DASA guns. So I found this to be a very interesting topic to cover more in depth and specifically. As well as, go ahead and take this as an opportunity to put these guns on the timer at the range and create some data from that as well. And the findings might be a little bit of a surprise, which, you know, let's leave that little teaser here for a little bit. For now, why don't we go ahead and get into the definition of these different trigger systems. First off, what is double action? Well, double action is when the trigger performs two actions, that being to cock and release the hammer so that it strikes the firing pin. So we can see that exemplified in this SIG M11A1. So I pull the trigger, the hammer moves to the rear, I hit the wall, I hit the point where the trigger is going to break. The trigger breaks, and that would have fired a round had the gun been loaded. Now, single action is when the trigger performs one action. This is some highfalutin definitions here. So in this case, the trigger just releases the hammer so they can strike the firing pin. So as we can see here, the hammer's cocked back, and then when I pull the trigger, the hammer is released. Now, double action, single action is when you have hammer down, the gun has a double action trigger. So my first round fired will be in double action. Then the slide will cycle, and all of my subsequent shots will be fired in single action. Every time the slide cycles, the gun will return to the single action mode. And then whenever I lower the hammer, in this case through the use of a decocker, I now have a double action trigger yet again, for whatever reason that I may want one. All right, so that's DASA. Striker fired exemplified in this Glock 45, chambered 9mm. Striker fired is when you have a spring-loaded firing pin, known as a striker, that is partially cocked. And the amount that it is cocked changes depending on what gun it is that you're talking about. And as you pull the trigger, the movement of the trigger cocks the striker the rest of the way and then also removes a positive block, allowing the striker to impinge the firing pin. Okay. Now, striker-fired systems are actually quite old. A lot of people have a tendency to think that they, like, more or less link up with the design of, like, polymer handguns, you know, like Glocks or the original VP70 and stuff like that. But striker-fireds go all the way back to the PO8 Luger, the bore-sharp pistols, as well as bolt-action rifles and anything that's based off of a Mauser design. Or anything stemming from that time period. Striker-fired systems are not new. Their relevance in the market as being, you know, a trendy thing that everyone's shooting, that is relatively recent within the last 40 years. Now, I have seen in some places where striker fired has been described as double action. When you think about it, seeing as the trigger is both cocking and releasing the striker, I can understand where somebody would make that association. I remember years ago I was reading through some catalog or something like that, and it did list Glocks as having double action a double action trigger, and I thought that was really weird because at the time, you know, I'm a kid at this point. At the time, I associated double action triggers with being able to have a second strike capability, with being able to pull the trigger more than one time, which is something we'll talk about here after a little bit. And obviously, you can't do that with Glocks. So how could that possibly be a double action trigger? Now, looking at the definition, I can understand where somebody would make that association. However, I think it's more accurate to put the striker fired into its own category. Apologize, guys. I'm working on a cold right now, so I'm trying to beat it. All right, guys. So there's our definitions. Why don't I go ahead and talk about the pros and cons of these trigger systems? First off, safety. A lot of people have a tendency to associate safety with DASA guns, and I don't necessarily think that that's entirely accurate. And a lot of it stems from the trigger. So by having this very long double action trigger pull, it's commonly associated that, like, well, when you pull the trigger, when you actually break that shot, is because you actually wanted to take it. However, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. We talked about this previously on the channel. I do not associate safety with a trigger. If we follow our fundamentals of firearm safety, if I'm on the trigger, that means that I have actively made the decision that I'm going to engage this target. So my safety is not based around this. And that's the same thing whenever it is we talk about striker fire triggers with their trigger dinguses or whatever it is, their trigger mounted safeties on guns that have them. So a double action pull, in my opinion, is not safety, it is surety. So yes, I could have a 2.5 pound competition trigger in my handgun, and as I'm in a high stress situation getting ready to engage that target, I could wind up not having my sights completely settled when the shot breaks because that trigger's too light. I blow through the wall and stuff like that, and I send the shots wild. Now, in a competition type sense, at worst, I accrue some time. Maybe it changes my standing in the leaderboards and all that kind of stuff. In a self-defense type situation or in a duty type situation, I could kill someone I did not intend to, turning my justified self-defense shooting into a homicide investigation. Now, with a heavier trigger pull and all that kind of stuff, there's a better opportunity for me to make sure that I'm settled on my target before I engage. But that's not safety at that point. Now, another thing that some people might bring up is that there have been some drop safe issues over the years with different striker-fired handguns, right now most notably the CZ P10c. However, that's because SIG chose to forego having any type of trigger-mounted safety on their particular handgun, and it turns out that there's a reason that that type of thing is important. Who knew? So that's neither here nor there in this conversation. Now, another safety aspect a lot of people like to talk about, people who appendix carry oftentimes will choose a DASA gun. And that's because they can put their thumb on the hammer. So as they go to reholster the gun, if something were to snag that trigger, they'll feel it in the movement of the hammer, which shouldn't be moving at all. Now, again, I find this a little bit silly, and I kind of consider it to be based on an outdated notion of you shouldn't look your gun back into the holster. You should be threat oriented and all that kind of stuff. And that makes no sense to me. If I think there's still threats, if I think I'm still being actively engaged by threats or potentially engaged by threats, my gun shouldn't be going back into the holster. It's kind of the same discussion. I'm getting down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but whenever it comes to reloads, a lot of people are like, oh, you need to remain threat oriented whenever it is that you do a reload. But if doing a reload quickly and accurately means looking at the gun in order to be able to get it back into the engagement, I think that's more important than maintaining eye contact with your threat. Especially since we have a tendency to think in terms of a flat range where, yes, you're standing out in the open and you're engaging a target and all that kind of stuff. In reality, you should be working your way towards cover. So once you're behind cover and all that kind of stuff, you can go ahead and look at your gun, take cover, look at your gun, and reload to then get back into the engagement and all that kind of stuff. You don't need to maintain eyes on the threat. You need to get the gun back into the fight, because that's the most important thing. You can't win a fight just by looking at somebody. You have to have bullets going down range. And if your gun's not doing that, you need to get it back into the fight as fast as you can. Now, from a training aspect, I'm really leaning into the rabbit hole at this point, but I think this is important to say. From a training aspect, that means that you should not just be like taking one step in order to get off the X and all that kind of stuff, because that's apparently going to completely confuse your opponent. Like, oh my God, he moved. Where do I shoot now? You need to be actively moving towards some form of cover, which means shooting on the move. And most level 1 and level 2 courses don't do a lot of shooting on the move. And this comes back to the average gun owner is not as trained as they want to be. We'll make that point more solidly here in a little bit. Let's get back on track. So, looking your gun into the holster is important. Kind of nullifies a lot of the safety discussions whenever it comes to this particular trigger. Now, some people also associate reliability with either one of these trigger systems, and I don't know if that's necessarily entirely accurate, because they have pros and cons in two different ways. In general, whenever it is we talk about reliability, there's two ways we can go about ensuring reliability in the system. We can either A, have it super sealed up so it's difficult for stuff to get in there, tight tolerances and all that kind of stuff, doesn't leave a whole lot of room for debris to gather, or B, we can have everything nice and loose so that there's a possibility for things to be able to like fall out of the system and all that kind of stuff. They don't have the ability to be able to choke it up. In a striker-fired system, it is more self-contained than a DASA gun. Like we can see here, we have an exposed hammer and all that kind of stuff. So there's a place for, debris to gather that's going to potentially choke up the gun. However, as we've seen in a lot of people's like hefty torture testing for reliability of striker-fired handguns, if you do manage to get debris into the striker channel, it's going to deadline this gun. You're going to have to disassemble it and clean it in order to be able to get it back into the fight. So yes, as long as stuff stays out of the system, the gun is good to go. As soon as that's compromised in some manner, the gun's no longer good to go. Whereas with hammer-fired, with DASA guns, like yes, I have this exposed hammer, which means that I could potentially get stuff in between the hammer and the firing pin. That could absolutely happen. However, with that large opening, that's something that I can get a finger into and be able to clear away that debris, or perhaps through multiple pulls of the trigger, be able to propel that debris out of that channel. So by things being a little bit more open, I have the opportunity to be able to clean them out a little bit in order to have a reliable engagement with this handgun. So I would say that in different ways, they are both reliable and unreliable. Like there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. And honestly, if you're getting to the point of really choking these guns up enough to be unreliable, those are pretty extreme circumstances. And channels like the Military Arms channel will identify that as like, okay, well, the testing that I'm doing is well beyond what the average person would experience, but we're going to push these guns to the point of failure. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the feel of the triggers, how it is that they run and all that kind of stuff. First off, most people like that a striker-fired trigger is consistent all the time. It is the same trigger pull no matter how many times it is that you pull the trigger. Whereas with DASA guns, you have the double action to single action transition. So that first shot is that long, heavy double action pull, which a lot of people will have a tendency to pull that round, to pull it off target or something along those lines. And then they may mess up and think that they still have that heavy trigger pull for their next round when actually it's the lighter single action pull, and wind up throwing that round as well. Now, that is a training issue. And this is where we come full circle with what it is that I was talking about previously. Yes, it is very easy to identify something as a training issue. However, what I will say is that a striker-fired handgun with this consistent trigger pull is going to allow you to get more out of your training time. So if you're taking a brand new shooter and you're trying to get them up to a level of proficiency that's acceptable for either self-defense or duty type use, a striker-fired handgun is going to be more readily available for that type of application. They only have to figure out one type of trigger pull, which is going to mean that they're going to master it faster, allowing them to do more stuff, allowing them to get through more training with that handgun in a potentially compressed time frame. Whereas with the DASA gun, they're going to have to learn how to handle that double action trigger pull and then also learn how to handle that single action transition. It's more time on the range. It's more ammunition downrange. It's more money involved in the process. This is where people have a tendency to just say, oh, well, that's a training problem and leave it at that, when that is a very contextual aspect. The vast majority of shooters do not spend that much time on the range. They shoot maybe a couple hundred rounds every couple of months, something along those lines. The vast majority of shooters, I would also say, are fooling themselves as to how proficient they are for self-defense. If you're not attending courses, if you're not at the range more frequently than that, you're not actually progressing nor developing your skill. Now, of course, there's a lot of things that play into that. Things with the kids, things with the wife's got a honey-do list a yard long. The kids have got soccer practice and all that kind of stuff. You may not necessarily be able to make it out to the range all the time, but it's important to be very critical about your actual capabilities. And when you decide to pick up that DASA handgun, because John Wick used a P30 and now you want a P30, are you actually putting in the time to be proficient with that handgun? Or is it better spent going after something like a striker-fired handgun? We'll get into that more here in a minute. Now, in addition to that, a lot of people will complain about striker-fired triggers, that they feel very mushy or stagey, crunchy. A lot of those very negative attributes are associated with striker-fired triggers, and that is because you are compressing a spring with the movement of the trigger. Different amounts depending on different handguns. A Walther PPQ has a nicer trigger pull than a Glock does. However, both of them are inferior to what an actually good single action trigger is. And if you spend enough time on double action triggers, you can really start to recognize the benefits of a good double action trigger. Something that moves back very, very smoothly and easily and all those kinds of stuff. It's very easy to control that double action trigger and do what it is that you need to do, and then have a nice, potentially very crisp single action trigger. Now, of course, there are terrible single action triggers just as surely as there are terrible striker fired triggers. But if you put in the same amount of money, you will get more out of a actual hammer-fired single-action trigger than you will out of a striker-fired trigger. There are very few good stock striker-fired triggers, and a lot of these guns need upgraded triggers in order to actually be considered good. And even then, if you put that same money towards a single-action trigger, you would wind up with a better trigger overall. That's the kind of contextual aspect of that discussion there. So I would say that the biggest con to the double action, single action trigger is the training time. Whereas the biggest pro to the striker fire trigger is that same aspect, that you can get more out of your time training with that particular handgun. So with our pros and cons outlined, why don't we go ahead and get into the range portion of this particular video. Now, let's go ahead and get through some caveats. First off, guys, I want to remind you that my time out on the range is entirely bent towards generating content for the channel and for the Murph's Law official Facebook page. If you're interested in that, go ahead and check out the link in the description. So with that being the case, this is my time to train as well. So every time I do one of these comparison videos, I change up the types of drills that I'm doing in order to be able to make sure that I'm getting my training time in. Now, in addition to that, this SIG M11A1 comes standard with SIG's SRT trigger, the short reset trigger. And a lot of people are going to cry foul right off the bat because this is an exceedingly good DASA trigger. And I can understand that completely. However, the Glock 45 has Glock's Gen 5 trigger, which is the best of the Glock triggers. I'm sure there's someone out there who would argue with me on that. However, it is still considered to be the best of the stock Glock triggers out there. So I'm not necessarily doing the worst comparison overall. Now, size-wise, these guns are completely the same. length of the grips, length of the slides, and all that kind of stuff, 100% the same. And that's because even though the SIG is technically, the M11A1 and the 229 are technically compact handguns, they're only compact in name. They're not actually compact in size. This is the size of a full-sized handgun. Now, in addition to that, as I went through these drills and stuff like that, I used some shoot and see targets, and I would put target pasters over top of the impacts and all that kind of stuff. And there are times where it might be a little bit confusing to look at the target and be able to see the impacts. I was able to tell the difference between the impacts from the distances that I was shooting, so I could measure them appropriately for where that is applicable in the discussion coming up. And then, of course, as the target got worn out enough, I had a big old rip in it and stuff like that, where I was basically bridging the holes with other target pasters, like trying to get that done. That's when I would go ahead and add a new target. I was just trying to get the most out of my target time there on the range. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers the caveats that I can think of. If I have to, I'll add some more as we go. Let's go ahead and talk about what drills were the ones that we shot. So 3 drills, as is normal for any of my comparison type videos. The first drill was 5 rounds as fast and accurately as I could go. So it's not enough to just step up to the line and rip 5 rounds and be like, wow, I did that in like 1.5 seconds, but none of my rounds hit anything. That doesn't count. In this case, fast and accurate was the goal. In order to be able to see between these two handguns, which was going to shoot more accurately. That's what I'm trying to say. So 5 rounds on the timer. Then after that, the second drill was 5 rounds, slow fire, no timer, just focusing on the sights and the shot grouping. With our third drill being a malfunction drill. So bang, 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 however many shots fired, then a failure to fire, tap rack, get back into bang, and see how long it took to be able to do those types of things. So 2 of these drills were put on time. Everything else is just entirely based, well, 2 of these groups are, two of these drills are based on time. 1 of them is based entirely around accuracy. So why don't we go ahead and talk about our results, starting off with the 5 rounds, fast and accurate. All right, guys, keep in mind, I guess this is a lingering caveat here. This was done cold. Drill 1 is done cold. I got to the range, loaded up magazines, and then started filming and immediately ripping rounds. There was no warm-up session. In addition to that, I haven't been shooting in several weeks because some work stuff got in the way. So the Glock 45, I fired those 5 rounds as accurately as I could in 3.50. Whereas with the M11A1, I shot that shot string in 3.31. Okay, Murph, so you shot the M11A1 slightly faster. Not a big shot, right? Like, you already warmed up the Glock 45. Now the M11A1's of course going to do better. Okay, well, what were the shot groups, Murph? Well, the Glock 45 turned in a 3 1/4 inch grouping, whereas the M11A1 came in with a 2 15/16 inch grouping. So a not insubstantial difference between the two. Now, one of the key things here also, guys, is to make sure that all the rounds are inside of the 9 ring. That's more or less what I'm associating as being within the A zone on like a standard target and all that kind of stuff. Whereas if everything's inside of the 10 ring, that more or less would be the same as shooting inside of the A zone on a head target. Like index card sized box, and all that kind of stuff. So between these two handguns, I would say that the M11A1 definitely won out, which may be surprising because, well, Murph, I thought double action guns were supposed to be slower. We'll get to that in conclusions here in a minute. Okay, well, drill number 2, which is just slow fire for accuracy. Let's go ahead and check out that footage. All right, guys, the Glock 45 turned in a 4-inch group, whereas the M11A1 turned in a 1 3/4 inch group. That is a massive difference between the two. Let's discuss this a little bit more deeply. Now, something to keep in mind, this is not the greatest trigger in the world. Glocks are not considered to have the best striker-fired triggers, even in the Gen 5s. Like the PPQs or the PDPs are still considered to be better. Even the VP9s are considered to be better. This gun pretty soundly beat it. Now, something else I want to point out, I don't consider myself to be very good at slow fire. Like, I don't have a lot of patience for it. I actually find myself, I feel like I shoot better whenever it is that I'm shooting fast. Now, all of these engagements are being conducted at 7 yards. So, in my opinion, those shot groups should have been tighter regardless. But I'm very surprised at how much wider this shot group was. Some of it, I think, is because I'm not running a backstrap. I've been considering throwing like the medium backstrap onto this handgun because I do think it moves around a little bit more in my hand than it should. But I haven't done it as of yet. We'll see if I make that change at some point in the future. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and go to drill 3, which is the tap rack bang drill. All right, the Glock 45 did it in 4.62, whereas the M11A1 did it in 4.45, which the difference is still going to the M11A1. However, it wasn't as large of a disparity as when we just ripped the 5 rounds. So I found that to be kind of interesting all by itself. I would consider these guns to be incredibly comparable when it came to that. I don't think that's too much of a surprise. It's not like I have to bring back the double action trigger at that point or anything along those lines. I'm just stuck with a single action trigger as soon as that first round breaks. So we wouldn't really expect there to be too much difference between these two guns with the addition of having to clear a malfunction. Now, had I decided to, instead of just going straight to tap rack bang, pulling the trigger a second time, doing that whole, second strike capability, then I think the disparity would be closer between the two handguns, if not the M11A1 getting kind of left in the dust a little bit there. But as I mentioned before, that doesn't make any sense to me to do a second pull when I can just rack the slide and get back into the fight. At least I think I mentioned that before. All right, guys, so it looks like the M11A1 pretty much won in every one of these categories. Now, one thing that I will say is that I continued to shoot after that because I still had a lot of rounds left over and had more or less completed what I had intended to come out to the range to do for the channel on that particular day. But I decided to go ahead and keep shooting the first drill, the 5 rounds, as fast as I could, fast and accurately as I could, and work on that with both of these handguns because I haven't done that type of thing in a while, and I do have a competition coming up. So again, the goal was to keep everything within the 9 ring, representing going after an A-box target and all that kind of stuff, which I think is an important thing. That's something I have to work on a lot of times as a shooter, is I have to make sure that I'm not just trying to shoot really pretty groups whenever it is that I need to go fast. I also need to be able to shoot as fast and accurate as I can. And if accurate means taking up the whole A-box, as long as I'm not accruing additional time, that's fine. And between these two handguns, the fastest and most accurately I shot the M11A1 was in 2.45. .45 all in A zone. Most touching the inner circle and 1 bullseye. With all of those, most of those rounds, I should say, being inside of the 10 ring, which is pretty decent. Now, I did manage to shoot the Glock 45 faster at 2.30. But I had rounds that were landing outside of the 9 ring. So at that point, we're getting into like C-zone impacts and all that kind of stuff, which is accruing time in a competition type sense. So the fastest that I managed to shoot the Glock 45 and keep all the rounds in the 9 ring was 2.55. So overall, the M11A1 was faster for me than the Glock 45. Why is that? And this is what gets us into our conclusions here. I compete with this handgun, the M11A1, and I've competed with the Glock 45 and a whole bunch of other striker-fired handguns. However, I have competed with this handgun several times, and every time I've competed with it, I have ranked in the top 5 for my division. This gun and I work really well together. That SRT trigger is amazing. And I think one of the biggest things that I had, especially when it came to like the rapid shot strings and stuff like that, is that the reset on this handgun is very tactile. I know I'm back on that wall very quickly. I can feel it. I could probably hear it if my hearing wasn't shot, but whenever it comes to those rapid shot strings, like I know exactly when I'm back on the wall and I'm ready to get onto that next engagement and all that kind of stuff. Whereas the Glock 45 doesn't have as nice of a reset. And a lot of times people say, well, shooting the reset's stupid. You're not going to do that in real life. You're going to be flinging that finger around inside of the trigger guard and all that kind of stuff. If you train enough, you shoot to reset. If you spend enough time out there on the range actually working through these types of things, you will shoot to reset. And reset on this handgun is a little bit more crunchy. It's a little bit more stagey. It's cleaner than other Glocks, but it's still not as good as this short reset trigger, which it's right there in the name. So this thing is very fast in single action. And that's where I would not fault you for saying that maybe this wasn't necessarily a fair comparison, but I think when we talk about the fact that I compete with the M11A1, that I train around multiple handgun platforms, including DASA guns. I have multiple double action, single action guns. I have double action only guns. I have single action guns. I train with a wide variety of handguns, and I compete with a wide variety of handguns. I am that person who trains all the time. And at a certain point, when you train enough, you come to the point where you might prefer the nicer trigger in a DASA gun as opposed to a striker-fired gun. So in my opinion, a DASA gun might be an expert's weapon. Somebody who realizes that they would like a little bit cleaner trigger pull and all those types of things because they progress past the point of needing a simplified trigger system in order to be able to benefit from their training. Especially with me shooting multiple handgun platforms and all that kind of stuff, what I've come to find is that it's not so much the individual trigger that matters. It's my ability to read the gun and what it is that it's doing. So being engaged in the process of shooting, feeling whether or not that trigger has come all the way out to reset, feeling that double action trigger pull and making sure that I keep consistent pressure on it and all that kind of stuff so that it doesn't disturb my sights as I go through the engagement process and all those types of things. At that point, there are very tangible benefits to a DASA gun that really helps somebody who is capable of being that engaged in the shooting process. If you're somebody that only shoots every couple of months and only a couple hundred rounds a year, you will not necessarily be that engaged in the process. You will not get the most out of a DASA gun, whereas a striker-fired handgun is probably the better choice for you. Now, when it comes to the recommendations portion of this, whenever it is that I introduce new shooters, and I do so quite frequently, I have a very set course, set pattern for how it is that I introduce them. I start off with like a single action 22, and the whole point being is to kind of get them engaged in the process of going through and of shooting. So cocking that hammer back, building your trigger, building your grip, cocking the hammer, lining up your sights, breaking that shot. Then introducing semi-autos, where now every time you pull that trigger, it's going to fire. It's not going to be a matter of you have to manipulate other things. Semi-auto 22s at that point. And then I will often step people up next to my Browning BDA 380, previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description. And the purpose of that is to now introduce something that's not quite a full fighting cartridge like the 9mm, but it's something more potent than a 22. And having to actually deal with a little bit more recoil, but not a lot of recoil. So we're slowly, in how it is that I go through this, we're slowly introducing recoil and having to go through like management, recoil management and all those types of things, as well as by going to the Browning, we now also include fighting pistol type characteristics where it comes to the placement of the magazine release, the placement of the slide release, a safety, all those types of things. But it also makes somebody have to work through a DASA trigger. And then as we step up on the 9mm and stuff like that, I generally stick with striker fired handguns, but if somebody's so interested, I will also throw in DASA guns as well. And I've had people who wound up becoming more comfortable with a DASA trigger and liking other aspects of DASA handguns that drove them away from striker fired guns. And that's really what it comes down to. If you're invested in the shooting process and you can read that trigger and that's not necessarily a huge deal to you, striker, DASA, double action only, doesn't really matter, you're comfortable with those trigger systems, then it allows you to be able to prioritize other features. Magazine release placement, slide release placement, sight setup, whether or not the gun has optics, safety or no safety, all those types of things. That allows you to better be able to prioritize those types of features and not have and take one thing off your plate that you don't have to worry about as much anymore. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. This is definitely a little bit longer video, but I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day. 2.79.